Go. Yep, I got it. Thank you. Oh, you can just leave it on that slide. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Mother's Day. And a special Happy Mother's Day shout out to my mom, who is probably watching. She usually watches. She is actually the one who inspired my love for the Word. So I do appreciate that about her. Jose, will you open us up in a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, Lord. Thank you for the wonderful blessing it is to be a part of this church here, Tabernacle Baptist Church, Lord. Thank you so much for all the mothers in attendance today. Thank you for the mothers that brought us in this world and cared for us and helped raise us and give us all the love and wonderful grace that we could ever need. Thank you for the corrections. Thank you for the comfort. Help us to be a blessing to them. Help us to bring glory and honor to you, Lord, and also to our mothers. In Jesus' name I pray.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so last week we did a bit of an overview of this passage that we're starting to study in Matthew 23, verses 13 through 36. This is where Jesus pronounces 8 woes on the scribes and Pharisees. And these men are the religious leaders who are appointed by God to teach the people about the kingdom of heaven and how to enter therein by faith. But instead, they're more preoccupied with establishing a kingdom in their own image, right? The things that they expect the kingdom to be. And they're so preoccupied with that they're leading the people astray into bondage under their rules and regulations instead of the freedom to serve God under grace and by love. So a couple of weeks ago, we saw Jesus warning the crowd and his disciples about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Those who are here sure remember that. And what did he warn the people about? What did he tell them to do? And then he told them not to do something. So first he told them to do something. Yes, the things that the Pharisees and the scribes are teaching you to do those, observe those things. And then he told them not to do something. Yes, not to emulate what the scribes and Pharisees actually did, because they were preaching one thing and then acting in a different way, right? And then, so Jesus was calling them out for their pride in doing all these religious acts because they were just doing them for the praise and acclaim that they received from men. And then he taught about servant leadership, right? That the greatest in the kingdom is the one who's serving. And then last week we saw that the scribes and Pharisees were there within earshot when he was giving the people these warnings. And we know that because then Jesus turns his attention to them and he addresses the scribes and Pharisees directly. Now, do you remember what he calls them every time he pronounces, or almost every time he pronounces a woe on them? Calls them hypocrites. Imagine being a scribe and a Pharisee and being in denial, because as we talked about last week, if they weren't in denial, they would have repented, right? So the fact they didn't repent shows us that they're in denial about their sin. So imagine being a Pharisee and being called a hypocrite when you think you're the most righteous person in Israel or in Judea. And then we read the first woe that says, "But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in." So what did Jesus mean by ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in? What did Jesus mean by that? It's a nice, colorful way of putting something. Were they teaching how to get into the kingdom? How do we get into the kingdom? There's one way into the kingdom. Through the Messiah, his grace, right? And that's even apparent in the Old Testament. We talked about that last week, how even in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, David says, God, you don't want sacrifices. You don't want these empty sacrifices. God ordained the sacrifices for them to have a physical reminder of their sins before him and their insufficiency to pay for their own sins. That's all the sacrifices were. The sacrifices did not actually pay for their sins. It was supposed to be an attitude of the heart. You know, Jesus preaches all throughout, it's about the heart, right? It's about what you do in your heart. Well, that was existent even in the Old Testament. They just couldn't quite comprehend it. But Abraham was justified through faith, right? Because the law didn't even exist in his time. And yet, these men are teaching that the law is the way into the kingdom. Obey the law and obey all these rules and regulations that we've put on you. And because you're God's chosen people. And so Jesus comes and says, that's not the way. It's about the heart. And so because they've rejected Jesus, who is the way, right? In John, he tells us, I am the way, the truth, and life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And so by rejecting Jesus, they've rejected the only way into the kingdom, the only way to be saved. They were so focused on the law that they began worshiping obedience to the law instead of worshiping God. Instead of having a relationship with God, all they wanted to do was follow the law. Because, frankly, that's easier. It really is. It's visible. It's a checklist. It's easier than actually having your heart in it. And really, the law only had two purposes, and Galatians tells us those two purposes. Galatians 3:19 says, wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, which is Jesus, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. So it was to show that we are sinners. That's what the law was for. So you see, these things either please God or displease God. The things he says to do please him, obviously. The things he says don't do are the things that don't please him. And if you follow these rules, you can see what pleases God and what doesn't please God. So it was to show us what sin is, so we would understand that we are sinners. Thank you. So we can understand that we are sinners. That was the purpose of the first purpose of the law. And then Galatians 3:24 tells us, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So by knowing that we are sinners because of the law, we can recognize that we cannot be justified on our own. Therefore, we must turn to Christ for justification. So the law had those two purposes, to show us our sin and to lead us to Christ for justification. And anything outside of that is a misuse of the law God gave to Moses. And so they were misusing the law. They had made the law more important than a relationship with God. And that was the whole point of creating man, was to have a relationship with him. And even though the scribes and Pharisees didn't have the simplicity of the explanation that we have in Galatians, they should have been able to see it from the Old Testament scriptures I mentioned earlier. because Galatians also tells us the law wasn't even written in Abraham's time. It was actually written more than 400 years after Abraham died. Yet Abraham was counted righteous by God. He didn't have the law, but he followed the law out of love for God. And out of faith. So we see the Pharisees could have done the same thing as Abraham. They could have understood faith in God and love for God and obedience out of love because of grace. And so let's move on to the next woe, because I could go on and on about the law and its purpose, but we need to move on. Otherwise, I won't even get one verse done this week, because that was last week's verse. Okay. So last week, I mentioned there was only one woe that wasn't in any other version. Wasn't in the other versions of the Bible. It's only in the King James, and this is the one, verse 14. They still have this verse in other gospel accounts. It's just the manuscripts that they used for translating are different from what was used for the King James. And they don't have this verse in Matthew 23. They have it in the other gospels. But since I want to get through this and get through more than one woe this week, we're not going to discuss the validity or lack of validity of different manuscripts and different translations of the Bible. We don't have time for that today. It's much longer than that. Suffice to say, we're using the King James, and this verse is here in this version of the Bible. So we're going to go over it. So verse 14 says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation." Now this one's pretty obvious, right? What are the Pharisees doing wrong here in this verse? They're being hypocrites. And how are they being hypocrites? All these things are going to show their hypocrisy. This one here is about taking widows' houses, right? Which sounds just as terrible, or almost as terrible to us as it does to God. Because widows are one of the classes of people that are dear to God's heart. Exodus 22, verses 22 through 24 tell us, "Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot. And I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless." That's a pretty severe punishment for mistreating widows, putting any trouble on them. And God means it. This is His word. If you want to treat widows badly, well, maybe your wife will be a widow, and she'll get to see how you treated other widows. So they are a class of people very close to God's heart, along with orphans. So after losing their husbands, widows were in danger of losing their entire livelihood if their resources were not carefully managed. You have to remember, women weren't treated the same way back in these times as they are treated today. Men took care of all the finances. Women stayed at home, took care of the home, took care of the children, and men mostly took care of the finances in a couple. And that's just the way it was then. And so when the man died, that widow often had no source of income. Now we know from Proverbs 31 that that's not exactly the way God planned it. God did plan for women to have some kind of little business if they chose to, and because it talks about them making cloth and selling cloth. So it's not wrong for women to have something outside the home to help bring in income. It's actually applauded by God in Proverbs 31. I'm just saying it is. I'm not saying just because the culture of biblical times work that way, that it should be that way. Oftentimes, widows would become destitute when their husband, obviously their husband passed away. So they'd become destitute if their resources were not managed carefully. Yet these religious leaders, instead of helping these struggling women, helping them manage their resources, maybe helping them find a way to gain more resources, instead of helping them, the Pharisees would take advantage of them by placing heavy financial burdens on them and make them pay up for the debts that may have already been incurred. Or they would fail to protect them when others placed heavy burdens on them. So the creditors would come looking for their money, and these women would get no help at all. So then the Pharisees would end up foreclosing on their homes, because you have to remember, a lot of the Pharisees were businessmen. They weren't just religious leaders. They often had financial businesses. And because the same kind of qualifications that would make you a Pharisee make you pretty good at accounting too. It's, that attention to detail. And so they would often foreclose on the homes and take the homes from the widows and then make money off of selling those homes. Not necessarily, because it could still remain under their husband's name, because it belonged to their husband. Right. They could have kept the home, but oftentimes the Pharisees would, force them out, because who would collect? The creditor, who was often one of the Pharisees. They had stuff. Yeah, it's different. They had moved. They had moved and abandoned their land. Thank you. I was trying to think of exactly how to put it, so that was perfect. They would have sold that before moving to Moab.
And then they could just get it back. I know that's a separate title.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know in the U.S., men died in the U.S. and women could not keep their property here. It always went to the husband or the husband's family, like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And to the children and yeah. But suffice to say, the Pharisees could have helped. They were in a position, because they weren't just religious leaders, they were cultural leaders as well. Rome was the government, but they left a lot of the local government to the Jewish people, which was mostly the Sanhedrin, which was mostly the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees. And so they could have helped. They were in a position to help, and yet they didn't. So that's the point that Jesus is making here. Regardless of how all that worked, they were abusing their position to hurt people instead of help them. And then they would offer up prayers. I'm going to take your house. I'll pray for you. Right? What does James say about prayer? He says, don't offer up prayer if you're not going to actually help. Right? Don't just say, I'm going to pray for you. True religion is helping widows and orphans, according to James. So they would say, well, I'll pray for you. And Jesus says long prayers. Do you want to know how long the scribes and Pharisees prayed daily? Does anybody have any idea? Anyone want to guess how long they prayed daily? I'll give you a hint. It's hours. Nobody wants to even guess? hours? How much? 5 hours? Almost double that. Historians tell us that some Pharisees would pray up to 9 hours a day. Yes. That's not where we get our workday from.
When they were in Israel, the Wailing Wall there, I always wondered, they stand there and they do this thing.
Yep.
I never knew why they did it. They say this because they stand there so long it keeps their back from hurting.
Right.
I had never heard that.
That is, yeah.
Yeah.
That is very interesting, but that makes sense. So they would be there that long that they would have to kind of keep their back from hurting. But yeah, historians tell us that some of the Pharisees would pray up to 9 hours a day. Now, side point, which I shouldn't do too many of these, but there is something to take from that. They prayed so they could seem religious, right? Jesus says, you pray long prayers so that men will see you praying long prayers and think you're religious. Imagine what the world might be like if Christians prayed earnestly for 9 hours a day, or even half of that, or even a fourth of that. I know I don't necessarily spend hours upon hours of focused prayer. You're supposed to pray without ceasing. And that's what we're commanded to do in the New Testament, is pray without ceasing. Our minds should constantly be on prayer. Our hearts should constantly be in prayer. You'd think. But they weren't really praying to God. So
Not to pick on Catholics, but we come from a lot of Catholics.
yeah.
What do they do? They go through
The rosary.
the
The
radio.
ro- yeah, the rosary. Yep. And it's empty. And even though Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, don't do repetitive prayers, and yet they do. So, but I talked about that when I taught on the Sermon on the Mount, so I won't do it right now. So Jesus says here, I'm not shutting you down. I'm just saying that all these things we could talk about for hours on end. And Jesus goes through these 8 woes very quickly because the Pharisees should understand from what he says and have conviction. And we know they don't because eventually they have him put to death, right? So Jesus says here that they will receive greater damnation or a harsher punishment, whether he means here on earth or at Judgment Day. I don't know, and it really doesn't matter. The fact is, they're going to pay for this because they are in a position to help, and they are abusing that position to harm instead. And it's similar to what James says about pastors and Christian leaders in his epistle. In James 3:1, he says, "My brethren, be not many masters or leaders, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. God will judge leaders more severely than anyone else because he has given them greater responsibility. The greater your responsibility, the harsher the judgment." Okay, are we ready to move on to verse 15? We actually conquered one verse and we're ready to move on to the next one. It isn't even in most Bibles, and we spoke about it for 10 minutes. So verse 15 says, guess how verse 15 starts? "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." So does everyone know what a proselyte is? Yes, it's someone who's converted from one religion or a lack of religion to another. It's not a term that's exclusive to Judaism. It's anytime someone is converted from one religion to another, that's a proselyte. So when Jesus says, "Ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte," he's probably using hyperbole, which is exaggeration for effect, because it's doubtful the scribes and Pharisees traveled extensively to proselytize. They stayed mostly local where they knew they were appreciated. They did, however, make extensive efforts to create proselytes by attempting to convert non-Jews to religious Judaism. We know the Romans were there. People would come through for commerce. Excuse me, I've got really bad allergies today. I need a drink. People would come through for commerce, and they would try to convert them to Judaism. Now, in Deuteronomy, God tells the Hebrews that they're to be an example of God's goodness and blessing, so the nations will inquire about it and come to worship him. And so God did tell them to do that in the Old Testament. So Jesus is not condemning the effort to win converts. That's not what he condemns here. He condemns the belief system they are being won to. It's a system built around human rules and regulations and a rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. So that's what they're converting them to. Again, like he said in the first woe, right? You shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. And that's what they're doing. Again, he's accusing them of the same thing. You're leading people into something that does not lead to God. They were hypocritical religious leaders, and they were redirecting people onto a path leading to hell rather than to God and heaven. That's what he means when he says you make them twice a child of hell that you are, because these people become even more convicted because of the way the Pharisees would preach and teach. They would put such conviction on people that some of these people were even under more conviction to follow the law than the Pharisees were, because they felt condemnation from the Pharisees for not being under the law. So again, they're not accomplishing the purpose God called them to. You have to remember, Jesus is calling them out because they have been appointed by God, because God appoints all authority, right? All government is ordained by God. Yeah.
About what you just said, because I've always thought of it as being whenever they converted somebody that they had that false sense of security that what they were doing now got them into heaven.
Right.
So that just, because you were saying it made them feel more condemned. But
It's both. They had this false sense of security that they were on their way,
right.
they were on the right path.
They were on their way to hell before, and now they're still in.
Yeah, and they're convinced that they're not. So that's a good way to put it. That's I guess I didn't do that clearly, but yes, like Julie was saying, also they had this conviction that they were on the right path, and yet they're still headed just as much to hell as they were before their conversion to Judaism. So thank you. But again, not doing what God called them to do. Now we'll move on to verse 16. This one says, "Woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, Whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and by all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon." So this is the only one of the 8 woes where Jesus starts with something other than, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." Now, I don't know which one's worse, calling them hypocrites or calling them blind guides. I guess it's roughly the same thing anyway. They don't see where they're going. Now, calling them blind guides is similar to Jesus' reaction when in Matthew 15, if you remember when we studied Matthew 15, the Pharisees pointed out Jesus' disciples were eating with unwashed hands. So that's the story where it happens, and Jesus tells them, not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. And then the disciples come to Jesus and they say, hey, we think you offended the Pharisees. You called them out, and we think you've offended them. And then Jesus' response in Matthew 15:14 is, let them alone, they be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. So the disciples have heard Jesus call the Pharisees blind before, back in Matthew 15. So here he calls the Pharisees blind to their faces. And then he pulls out their hypocrisy, and he talks about taking oaths. Now, back in Jesus' time, Middle Eastern people would swear oaths on sacred objects. And the Gentiles could even swear by their gods. Now, the Jews couldn't even mention God's name directly, because that's how they interpreted the commandment not to take God's name in vain. They figured any conversation is vain conversation. Therefore, we should never say God's actual name. So they don't use the term Yahweh or Jehovah when they speak, because they believe that speaking God's personal name and that it would be sin according to the Ten Commandments. So they couldn't even mention his name directly, so they definitely couldn't swear by it like the Gentiles would do. So what they would do is they would swear on objects close to God, like the temple or the altar, as Jesus points out here. Now, the problem Jesus is pointing out here is they had developed a shady practice of grading oaths to where some were binding and some were non-binding. And it depended on what object they swore by. So Jesus states two of these instances as examples. They aren't the only examples, but Jesus isn't going to list off every single one they have. So they said that swearing by the temple or by the altar was a non-binding oath. So if you could swear by one of those things, so they'd say, well, I swear by the temple that I'll pay you this, or I'll do this. That was a non-binding oath. But if you were to swear by the gold of the temple, or you swore by the sacrifice that was put on the altar, well, that was even closer to God, in their opinion. And therefore, that was a binding oath. They would swear by heaven, by earth, which Jesus points out as well. And different, if you swore by the earth, then no big deal. You didn't really have to fulfill that oath. If you swore by heaven, well, then you better fulfill that oath. So it was kind of a way of trying to trick people into believing you and not being bound to actually fulfill your oath. Now, Jesus had already preached against the evil of this practice during the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5:33 through 36, he says, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, and this is going to sound familiar because it's going to sound like what we just read, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black. And then Jesus goes on to say, let your yes be your yea be yea, your nay be nay. When we speak to people, we shouldn't have to promise them we're going to do something. If we say we're going to do something, then we do it. If we have no intention of doing it, then we shouldn't tell them we're going to do it just to be nice. That includes praying. You know, sometimes somebody says, oh, I'm having trouble with this, or I'm dealing with this, and we say, oh, I'll pray for you. And then we walk out the door, we never mention it to God again. When we say we're going to do something, Jesus says we should do it. There should not be a question of what we swore on, whether it's close to God or not. Our practice as followers of Christ should be to be good for our word. And then Jesus even points out, like I said, they believed they couldn't swear on God, so they'd swear on objects close to God. But Jesus points out that while they're trying to avoid swearing by God himself, by swearing by the temple, they're essentially swearing by God who dwells therein. And yes, it is true that God is too great to dwell in a building. But we see in 1 Kings, where Solomon prays over the freshly built temple, that he did build the original temple. Of course, this isn't the same one. This is the rebuilt temple. But the one that Solomon built, the first temple, he prays over it when it's freshly built. He says, I have surely built thee an house to dwell in, a settled place for thee to abide in forever. And then he recognizes, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded? So God is too great for a building. Yet, his presence did dwell in the temple. It was the meeting place. Exactly. Thank you, Bob. We do have Jesus now as our meeting place. We don't have to go to a specific place. Yes, we commune with God when we come here to church, but we don't come to this building because we have to be here to commune with God. We come to this building so that we can commune with God with our fellow saints, with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so the temple was the meeting place. It was God's house on earth. And he did meet his people there. So when they would swear by the temple, Jesus says, it's like swearing by God himself anyway. It's foolishness, is what Jesus is pointing out, and you're blind to it. You keep doing these things and acting like it's okay and the reason Jesus calls them blind and not ignorant, there's a difference between being blind and ignorant, right? They're not ignorant. Why would I say they're not ignorant? They know the word. Most of them know it by heart. And all these concepts that Jesus brings up, Jesus really doesn't bring up any new concepts here. These are all things you can find in the Old Testament. Have you noticed how many of the Old Testament scriptures I've brought up? They're all things you can find in the Old Testament that Jesus brings up here. So they're not ignorant. That's why Jesus calls them blind. They know it's there, but they're blind to it. And they have the worst kind of blindness. It's voluntary blindness. Because if they were to analyze the scriptures without any bias, they would be wrong. And like we said, they are in denial of their sin. Because if they weren't in denial, what would be their response to Jesus? Somebody, what would be their response to Jesus? They'd repent. Yeah, they'd at least interview him and ask him to explain what they're doing wrong. But we have no record of that. We actually have record of them hardening their hearts. So it's a voluntary blindness. They are choosing to believe what they believe instead of rightly dividing the word, right? That's what we're commanded to do, is to rightly divide the word of truth. That doesn't just apply to Christians. The Jewish people should have been observing God's word. That's why God throughout the Old Testament says, learn my word, speak my word, practice my word. Bind it on your foreheads and on your wrists. He didn't mean literally. He meant remember it's there and act on it. And then just as Jesus pointed out in the Sermon on the Mount, he says that even swearing by heaven is swearing by the very throne of God. Isaiah 66:1 says, thus saith the Lord. So this is God speaking. This isn't even a man surmising this. This is actually God speaking. Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye build unto me, and where is the place of my rest? So Jesus is saying, heaven is God's very own throne. And when you swear by heaven, it's offensive. And besides all that, Jesus says, don't even swear by anything. Just do what you say you're going to do. So as we continue looking at these woes, we see that Jesus has really focused on how the Pharisees have completely missed the mark of the responsibility God had given them to lead the people. In fact, it's as if they were shooting in completely the opposite direction. So next week we'll continue, try to get through the rest of the 8 woes. There are 4 left, so hopefully we can make it. Bob, will you close us out in a word of prayer?